stage. I can put it a little bit closer. See if you at the back of the room, can you hear me?
No, this is
okay. So they've got a good level. Welcome everybody to BioLunch. So BioLunch is something that the biology department tries to do every week. That at noon on Friday we have some sort of speaker who comes and talks to us about some aspect of biology. And very often we have a professor, either one of ours or a visiting professor who talks about their research. We also bring in people who work in biology, people who are employees of places like Texas Parks and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, medical schools. We had a CSI type person that was here earlier this semester. So our goal is to give biology students an opportunity to learn more about biology, their career opportunities, and how to get prepared for those careers. So that's kind of the backdrop. That's why we're having. That's why we're here today. Next week, for those of you that are in biology, the rest of you probably don't care. Next week, our speaker is our own Dr. Maya Lastra, who are we good? Who this summer, during summer session 1, for the first time, he's going to be offering a course that includes a field trip. It is going to explore the varied ecosystems of the state of Texas. So you're going to be driving around the state, visiting different areas, learning about primarily the plants and the plant communities, how they're different, but also how the climate or the abiotic factors of that part of the state influence what lives there. So we have a history in biology, having done study abroad. This is, I don't know, study in broad, right? Study across the state. So for those of you that are interested, that's next week's BioLunch. All right, thank you. So I guess I'm ready to go. So this is the title that many of you saw publicized, and maybe it wasn't the best title because it might be a little misleading. I'm not, I don't think, going to talk about anything that is legal or illegal. What I'm going to actually be talking today about what is the concept known as intersex. And it does kind of border some legal things that have happened recently, and I will touch on some of those at the very end of my talk. So that you know, the seed of giving this presentation is I got asked to do a talk. I'm going to be at Tyler Junior College next month, and a former student of mine is a professor there, and we talked about what kind of talk I might give for a variety of different types of students, and she had heard me talk about some of these things, and because of the political situation in the news, she said, yeah, that would be great. And I decided, okay, if I'm going to do this, let me practice it. So you are here for my practice talk. The majority of the slides I'm going to show you and the things that I'm talking about are in no way new. Many of these topics I've been teaching for over 20 years here at ASU. I do have some updated slides and a couple of things that I had to create to connect different topics so that it would make sense to you. But most of this is not new. I'm not entirely just reacting to today's political climate. This is a part of biology. All right, and then because this is a practice talk, I want you to know that I invite feedback. In fact, I encourage you to pull out something and take notes, right? This is not a class. It's not going to be a quiz. But I really want to know if something's boring, if I talk about something and you don't understand how it connects to the other things that I talked about. If you see a typo, right, let me know. And I already know that because I took these slides from different presentations and created kind of like a Frankenstein's monster, that the colors in the font don't exactly stay constant. Maybe if I have more time, I'll fix that. It would be great if I did. But we've got to live with where I am today. All right, a couple of other notes before I get started. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today, I am not an expert. I have read about these things. I know enough so that I feel comfortable teaching about them. I know enough that I can have an intelligent conversation about many of these topics. But if you really want to get into some of the nitty-gritty details, for example, I'm going to talk about some specific genes and what they do. I don't know all of the detail. We will have to get somebody else involved in the conversation. And it just so happens, I should have warned her about this. I started, but you walked away, that one of our professors, Dr. Lori Fawn, has actually done research that involves some of these reproductive genes that I'm going to talk about today. So if you ask me questions afterwards, I may defer to her on a few of the topics. I also want you to know that this is not supposed to be a political talk. And in fact, if you came here expecting that I am all ready for a fight because he's going to say things I absolutely know are wrong and I'm going to get up and argue about it, I suspect you're going to be disappointed. And for those of you that came here thinking, okay, I absolutely know he's right, and I'm going to feel all energized about being correct, I'm probably going to disappoint you too, because I'm hardly going to touch on anything that's political. Right? I'm a biology professor. I teach biology, and that's what I know. So that's what I'm doing. I also feel like I need to protect myself a little bit and point out that I am not representing Angelo State University's administration. The Texas Tech University system, I think, is worried but doesn't know what I'm going to talk about. And certainly the state has not approved it. I'm not speaking on behalf of any of those entities, right? This is just me as somebody who knows a little bit of biology. I also need to warn you, right? This is an adult presentation. There's going to be some images that are graphic. I am going to show you a couple of images of animals having sex. That's what the talk is about. I am going to show you a photo of women's bare breasts. I'm going to show you drawings of genitals and some other organs, because I can't really talk about sex without including some of that stuff. So if you're not comfortable, you're here voluntarily. I primarily teach biology for non-science majors, right? In fact, many of you in the room have had me for a core curriculum class. And in my first week of those courses, I always show this photo. This work of art by Pablo Picasso is, I believe, owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It has not been on the market for a long time, so we really don't know how much it's worth. But in the late 1900s, right, the late 20th century, some of us remember those years, this work of art was declared as the most important work of art of the 20th century. I don't know if that's right. I don't know how to judge what is good art. And particularly as a scientist, I don't know how to make that decision. Now, you could ask me some other questions. For example, on the second floor of this building, there are some machines that if I could get a little piece of paint, I'd probably be arrested first, but if I could get a little piece of paint off of that painting, they can tell us why do certain areas look purple, other areas look black. Right? They could do that type of analysis. If we flip this around, I'm pretty sure that it is material that's wrapped around a wooden frame. I know people who can tell us what kind of tree that wood came from. Using carbon-14 radio dating, we could figure out if the date of the frame is consistent with a work of art that's 120 years old. Those are the types of questions that science can answer. And I tell my students that I want them to think of science as being a tool. It doesn't have to be a hammer, but as a tool. Tools are things that we have created as humans that help us to do certain jobs. Okay? A hammer, just like any other tool, is really good at doing certain things. It is limited in what it's good at doing. So if you happen to have a big pile of wood and a couple of pounds of nails, then a hammer is exactly what you need in order to build something. But on the other hand, if the issue in front of you, if your problem is a flat tire, yeah, that hammer is not really going to help you very much. So does that mean that hammers are bad tools? No, of course not. It is obvious to us that we have different tools for different purposes. In fact, anybody who wants to do very much building or fixing of things, they have a toolbox. You have to have a diversity of tools for doing different sorts of things or answering different types of questions. Okay, so we're going to talk about science. This is my metaphorical representation of life. I'll explain it to you in a minute. And there's a whole lot of space we'll talk about, and there's a relatively small circle in the middle. That circle represents what we know from science. And if I enlarge that series of circles, you'll see that in the middle, the core, if you will, is scientific knowledge. These are things that have been studied, examined, observed, in some cases for centuries, that we are all pretty sure we understand, right? The function of our liver, the way that a heart beats, the role of the carbon cycle in the world around us. We can consider that to be scientifically factual material. Somehow outside of that is information that we're basically still learning. And I think we all know that we are regularly hit with information about something that causes cancer, or some gene that's responsible either for protecting us or for causing cancer, right? We all know that we're still learning about that. So science continues to advance and expand. Outside of that, at least in this figure, is something that this textbook called fringe science. The suggestion here is it's on the edge of science, and we don't really know if it's good information or not. I'll suggest to you that a whole lot of advertisements you see pretend to be science, and we don't really know that they are. Right? How many dentists recommend Crest toothpaste? It's also, and I think this is a shame, maybe this is too political, but the GNC store, which I think they still have at the mall, they will sell you a pill to fix almost any problem you have. And it is the law in the United States that as long as they don't call it a drug, they can sell it. Right? And so if your memory's not good enough, you can buy memory pills. If you don't think you're sexy enough, you can buy sexy pills. And there's no guarantee that they work. Every once in a while, we find out that one of those things really does work. For example, when the Northern Europeans, the pilgrims, if you will, first came to North America, they were taught by some of the Native Americans that when they had a toothache, they should chew on a willow twig, which seems really way out there. But guess where we found aspirin? The inner lining of willow trees. So some of this stuff that's way out there will never be validated, will never actually be part of science, but a little of it may eventually. And then we've got everything else. And for this particular diagram, they call it beyond the fringe. Not necessarily because it's bad, but because this is the stuff that science can't measure. This is the stuff that science can't tell us what are good ideas and what are not good ideas. And so if I shrink this back to the way it looked when I first started, now let me fill in some of all of the many topics that fit in that area that is outside of what science is any good at understanding. And so I'm here today as somebody who's learned a little bit about how to use one tool, and I'm going to share with you some things that I've learned through other people, other scientists, that we understand about how the world works. But those things do not necessarily directly impact any of the rest of the world. And I'll point out for one really good example that I hope every one of you has a whole lot of love in your life. But don't ask a scientist to tell you if you've got enough, or does he really love you? as an introduction, let's talk about some science. Why does sex even exist? Okay, so whoever said to reproduce, thank you. It's the answer. I always get it's the automatic answer, but if I was grading your paper, it's like a C level answer. It's really not a very good answer because it's not very complete. So you see in the world around us, the majority of things that are alive reproduce without sex. You don't have to have sex to reproduce. Here's an image of a flatworm in planaria. This is a little organism that you can actually see without a microscope, maybe the size of a fingernail at the most, and you're looking at reproduction, right? This is one specific individual that ate, it got fat and happy, and it's reproducing, right? No sex involved. This is the rule for a lot of small single-celled organisms. And in fact, the whole reason I can get away with saying that the majority of life does this is because there are so many bacteria in the world. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of all living things are bacteria. This is what they do. So that's the majority. But even life that's more complicated doesn't have to have sex to reproduce. This is a relative of jellyfish, Hydra. And this particular one, you can see it has an arm growing out of it, the polyp, except that that little arm-like structure, when it gets large enough, it's going to break off, and it's going to be a whole new living individual, right? Without anything that resembles sex. And in the world of plants, we're surrounded by all sorts of plant reproduction that is vegetative, right? No sex is involved, right? Grasses in your yard and things like wild strawberries can spread out runners. It can become lots of new little plants, and things like potatoes, tubers, and the bulbs of onions. It's a way of reproducing, so you have new plants next year that didn't require sex. So sex is more than just reproducing. It does something different. And I'll point out to you that there's a few forms of life. Bees and their relatives around us, they commonly reproduce both with sex and without sex. Every hive has individuals that were produced either through sex or without sex. If I had more time, I could spend 20 or 30 minutes talking to you about some of the variations of this and some of the cool stories in biology about reproduction without sex. But I don't have time. So that exists, but we're not going to talk about it anymore. Things that reproduce sexually. What we have learned is that the majority of time that things reproduce with sex, it requires two cells that are not equivalent in size. There's a few exceptions, but the majority, you have to have what we commonly call an egg, and you have to have a sperm. Two sperm don't ever reproduce. Two eggs, there might be an example or two if there's not very many. You have to have one of each. And yes, studies have been done. I can talk a little bit about why this is the case. And so this is the very definition of what it means to be male or female. Right, is do you make small gametes, the things we call sperm, or do you make large gametes, the things we call eggs? And this is what most biologists would call the primary sexual characteristic. This is the primary difference between being male or female, is do you make eggs or sperm? So what do you make? Have you ever asked anybody? You make eggs? Yeah, probably not going to pick up line on Saturday night. But it's also not needed. It's not really relevant. And well, it is relevant, but it's not really needed because in things that sexually reproduce, we need ways of recognizing. Right? If I'm a sperm producer, I got to look for some egg producers. And so we usually wear some way of advertising what we are. Is this good enough? kind of, and most of us relate to this and understand what it means. I will point out to you that when you travel the world, you might have to be careful. So let's imagine that this weekend you go to the mall. Yes, San Angelo really does have a mall. It's not much of a mall, but it's still there. And a couple of 100 feet in front of you, walking the same direction so their backs are to you, you see a couple of people. Can you tell if they're male or female? Maybe.
I can make an assumption.
You can make an assumption, and you would often be right. So we all recognize that breadth of shoulders, the ratio of waist to hip are pretty good indicators in who's male and who's female. And these are examples of characteristics that we call secondary sexual characteristics. So the primary sexual characteristic, right, the definition of male and female, do you make eggs or do you make sperm? We also secondarily have characteristics that are associated with those. So in addition to the relatively width of these body parts, probably the most obvious ones is can you or do you grow a beard or have you developed breasts? And we're used to recognizing those and using those as a signal of what sex an individual is. But sometimes they don't work. And so this next image, one of the ones that might bother some of you, this is a not photoshopped, unretouched photograph of a person who I believe still lives in the New York City area. And you tell me, what sex is this person? So it's immediately maybe a little disturbing because you're getting mixed messages. Right? Secondary sexual characteristics, as somebody said, you can usually assume that you know what they represent, but they're not 100%. And to answer the question you're all thinking, this is actually a woman. She just happens to have a gene that influenced her to grow a whole lot of hair. So throughout the animal kingdom, there's lots of examples of what we call sexual dimorphism. And that is when the sexes look differently. And this provides a variety of different benefits to the animals, but perhaps, we could argue about this, perhaps the most important is that it makes it really obvious who's a potential mate, right? Who are the males and who are the females. Right? There's certainly other things going on as well, but that is sexually dimorphism. We can also talk about, kind of taking a step backwards, that sexual difference or dimorphism between our gametes, right? The fact that eggs have to be large and sperm have to be small. And this actually creates a bit of a problem in that males and females, and I did this based on humans, our genes are more than 99.5% identical. Now, yeah, we all have a little bit of genetic variation, but we have the same exact genes, except for very, very few of them. And so somehow we have to take a basic body plan, and in that basic body plan, we have to create individuals that create eggs and other individuals that create sperm. And some, not all, but some of that less than 0.5% of our genes does that. And so that's where we're going next, is so how do we develop a reproductive system? And I'm going to show you a couple of images that are based on this. These are all photographs of very early human embryos. If we had a picture of the egg being fertilized, what is called a zygote, it would be so small you couldn't even see it. And then you can see that this goes through to, it says, about 60 days of development, so roughly 2 months. And we're going to talk about some of the things that are happening in the middle of this. So I've pulled out a couple of those images here. One is about 1 month and one at about 2 months. And when you are closer to this appearance than this appearance, inside of each of us, you were growing organs that are called mesonephros. Yeah, you don't have to write that down, right? No quiz. Mesonephros become kidneys in some types of animals, but not in us. In us and some other animals as well, they're going to become the gonads. So the gonads are the organs that either make eggs or they make sperm. And so early in development, all of us have grown these. In addition to these organs, we also grow 4 tubes, 2 pairs of tubes. One of those sets of tubes has the ability to become the vas deferens. This is the tube that sperm swim through. The other set of tubes have the potential of becoming oviducts, right, or fallopian tubes. 2 words for the same thing, part of the uterus that eggs have to move through. Every single one of us have all 4 of these, 2 of each. Because at this point in development, this embryo doesn't know if it's going to be male or female. And the way that the genes work and turned on, this started before it knows. This may also be an example of why guys have nipples. Something that started to grow that turns out males don't really need, but the embryo hadn't made that decision yet. Do I need them or not? And they grew. So you go a little bit later in development and genes start getting turned on and you get that tissue starts to become either testes or it starts to become ovaries. And the sets of tubes, if this is an individual that's going in the male route, the tubes that are going to become vas deferens, they stick around and the other tubes start to dissolve or degenerate, and vice versa in females. So that by the time you get to birth, you have males who have developed testes and the vas deferens tubes are there and ready to be functional. They don't do anything in a newborn yet. And if you took the other route, whoops, I'm sorry, I clicked too fast. If you take the other route, you've got ovaries and fallopian tubes adjacent to them. So both of these things are going on, right? The development of the gonads and the development of these tubes. So a few years ago, I stumbled upon a scientific paper that's not new. It's from the 1990s, but I didn't know it. That came out in the Canadian Journal of Zoology, and some biologists got a hold of some beavers. So beavers are these cute little rodent, well actually, they're not little, a big beaver's 100 pounds of rodent. And in the northern states of the United States and Canada, people still trap them for their fur. So beaver fur still has value. And people who trap them, skin them, and then the rest of the carcass is not worth much, right? There's not a big market for beaver meat. And so these biologists got a hold of some beaver carcasses and decided, okay, let's open them up and look inside and see what we found. And what they found is that in 20 out of 24 male beavers that they examined, the males, well, do you see the title of the article? Persistent paramesonephric ducts, masculine uterus. So we would not call it masculine uterus. These are those female tubes. So in 20 out of 24 beavers, male beavers, they didn't lose those tubes. They still have the female tubes inside of them. Now, we have no evidence that that in any way changed their lives. As far as we know, they were perfectly functional males. They just had this female remnant inside of them. Could that happen to humans? So, like any of you would do, I did a Google search and found that. Which is totally fake clickbait. That is not at all what was actually described. Instead, what they found was a male that still had those female tubes. And in fact, if you go into the medical literature, you can find several publications, but this is one of them. So one particular physician wrote about 157 cases of having a guy with these female tubes still inside of him. It usually doesn't cause any problem. It usually doesn't in any way change their maleness. It is just evidence that we all started out with both of those, and that the process of developing, and in this case degenerating, it's not a perfect process. We know how to expect that it will work, but it doesn't always work that way. So, what causes an embryo to go male or female? I'm sure that most of you know that in us it's related to the Y chromosome. That a typical male has 46 chromosomes, and you either have 2 X's or an X and a Y. So this is what's considered the norm. Note that the Y chromosome doesn't look like Y. It's not a very large chromosome. In fact, it has very few genes on it. This is the way that mammals, humans and other mammals do it. This is not the way that all animals do it, so just a fun fact. If you're a fan of birds, bird sex chromosomes are the exact opposite, that you have to get a specific chromosome to become female, and if you don't get that chromosome, then you're a male. We also have a bunch of reptiles that whether they become male or female is all about what temperature that the egg gets incubated at. So this idea of the Y chromosome being the decider is not universal. So the Y chromosome has this specific role in our body simply because of one gene. This one gene is called the SRY gene. And that is depicted up here, sex-determining S region R of the Y chromosome. And what it does is when it gets turned on, it makes a protein, the SRY protein, that causes an effect on, I didn't mean that, causes an effect on other genes in different parts of the body, and you make more proteins that have different effects, and one of those, shown on the left side here, ends up causing the vas deferens to be reinforced, and the production of something called DHT. And remember that because I'm coming back to that. On the other hand, there's another set of proteins in cells that they're responsible for getting rid of those female parts. And so you can imagine in 20 out of 24 beavers and some number of human males, one part of this worked and the other part didn't. And once again, that's something that we know can happen. Now, it's not just one single switch that is on or off. There are so many steps. This is often called a cascade. The idea of a waterfall where one thing triggers another, triggers another, triggers another, and you can have a problem any step along the way. All right, so for internal anatomy, if I was going to summarize this, I would say that we started, all of us, with identical structures, and then what we had is a difference of emphasis in how they developed. What about the outside of our bodies? So this is computer generated, an image of a 6-week-old human embryo. Is this going to be a baby boy or a baby girl? It's a trick question. You can't tell. At this point in development, we all look exactly identical. Early in development, we grow this thing that is called the genital tubercle, this little thing that sticks up, and on the bottom of it, it has an opening, a groove, and then it's got these folds on the side of it, and we all have all of these. And then depending on whether or not you have that SRY gene and whether it's doing its job or not, you go into one of two pathways. And in the one case, that tubercle grows, elongates, and the groove at the bottom seals up. Usually, there's actually a common birth defect where it doesn't seal up correctly. And those folds that were there end up becoming the scrotum, the home of the testes. Or, if you didn't go that way, then the tubercle doesn't grow very much, it becomes the clitoris, and that groove that was at the bottom becomes the opening of the vagina. And so again, what we end up with, we think of as being distinctly different, right? At least in most societies, right? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? We emphasize the differences, but we started out exactly the same. So that SRY gene triggers the development of the gonads. As the gonads develop, you start to get hormones, a variety of hormones, including testosterone and estrogen, and particularly in women through your life, it becomes more complicated because of pregnancy. Whatever the hormones are that you end up with, they have an influence on how your internal genitals develop and also your external genitalia as well. And at any step of the way, something can go wrong. So, understanding that we start from one place and typically develop one or the other, for several thousand years at least, people have wondered, is it possible to be both? Right? So this is a woodcut from, I think it's a German publication. You'll see it's over 500 years old. So we call individuals that are both sexes hermaphrodites, and we are surrounded by hermaphrodites of different organisms. Some of you learned perhaps in middle school that there are plants that have what we call perfect flowers. And a perfect flower is a hermaphrodite. It creates, we use different words, but it creates both the small gametes and the large gametes all in the same thing. Right? So that's a hermaphrodite. That's fulfilling the role of both sexes. We have some animals that are this way too. This is a nematode. Nematodes are small parasitic worms that if you grow tomatoes year after year after year in the same piece of garden, they cause a problem with your tomatoes. And the typical nematode every time is both male and female. Every earthworm that you've seen is the same way, right? Whether they're in your garden on the sidewalk after a heavy rain or if you're buying them for bait, every earthworm is a hermaphrodite. They have one part of their body up near their head end that is male and creates sperm, and a little bit further back they have a part of their body that is female and creates eggs. And so when you see two earthworms crawled up along each other this way, see the white substance? They are mating with each other. And in one, if the earthworm on top is the A worm, in one part of the body, A is inseminating B, and in another part of the body, B is inseminating A simultaneously. So I always wondered if I had the opportunity to hang out at a bar with a couple of earthworms and they were talking to each other, that they might get to the point and say, oh my God, this is crazy. Your dad is my mom. That could happen. And that's the rule for earthworms. And some other animals too. Here's a sex and a couple of snails. Each one is inseminating, giving a sperm to the other individual. So we are surrounded by hermaphrodites. But of course, most of you don't care about all of them. You want to know about humans. Ancient Greece had a minor deity that was a hermaphrodite. There's a whole story that goes there, but I'll let somebody else teach you that. What about this person? So this is a relatively recent photo of what I think is just a really clever costume. Right? There's no reason there to think that it's not just a normal person wearing a costume. Or this guy, this is actually a much older photograph. If you look closely, notice that one leg and arm is shaved and the other leg and arm isn't. As far as I can tell, this is a guy who's trying to make money by appearing to be both sexes, and I'm pretty sure it's just a guy with a bra on. Because in fact, we have no records of a person being hermaphrodite. And we are pretty confident, having to do with hormones, that it would never happen. And let me point out to you that I'm using a strict definition of what is a hermaphrodite, which is a person who makes both eggs and sperm. But there's another condition, and actually I finally gotten to kind of the main point of today's talk. It took me a while. Let's talk about this person. So the runner wearing yellow and green is South African athlete Caster Semenya. Caster Semenya started training and got involved in track as a school kid, like many of you did. She became a little bit of a celebrity and ended up winning a couple of gold medals in the Olympics and 3 different world championships, all in 800 meters. And I have a short video, but because I'm going late, I'm going to skip the video. After one meet, when she just blew away the field and did much better than she'd ever done before, the athletic organization got suspicious and ordered testing. And she got disqualified. And when this initially happened, exactly what the test said was kept secret. And I absolutely, totally support that. This is her medical information. She had every right to keeping it secret. But in the years since, more and more people have talked about it, including her, and she's written a book. So what we know is that the problem is that she didn't pass their basic test for being a woman. And many athletic organizations where women compete, you have to be able to prove you're a woman if you get to the right level of competition. And it came out that what the problem was, or at least what it was rumored, is that she has a Y chromosome. And so since then, what we understand is that when she was born, right, she was called female. And you've got to believe that that means that little baby, little naked baby, people looked and said, yep, this is a girl. But then in her late teens, I think she was 19 when the test was done, she was told, you have a Y chromosome. Since then, testing has been done to show that she has a problem that is called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. She doesn't make this enzyme. It's an enzyme that we all have. It's not associated with the Y chromosome. I think it's on chromosome number 2. And it does a few other things in our body. But what's particularly important for this story is that it is responsible for taking testosterone, kind of normal testosterone, sometimes abbreviated T, and it converts some of that T into DHT. It's a hormone I mentioned a few slides ago that I told you was going to be important. Her body cannot make DHT. And DHT, as you can, or you can't see it yet, as you can see there, DHT is what causes male genital production. And so even though she had a Y chromosome, and that Y chromosome was perfectly good, she couldn't make normal testes. Now, she didn't make ovaries. In her abdomen, she has testes. Now, they're not fully developed. They do not make sperm, but they don't make eggs either. Because she has testes, she has what is considered to be a typical male level of testosterone. It has also come out that, so she doesn't have ovaries, she doesn't have a uterus, she does have a vagina. And so she is kind of a stereotypical case of what biologists say we should correctly call somebody who is intersex. That is, that they don't meet the normal definition of either of the two sexes. So I showed you this kind of simple flow chart of what happens with sex development. So her Y chromosome was perfectly good, and she started growing testes, but because she couldn't make the right combination of hormones, no DHT, that interfered with how her internal genitals developed and her external genitals. So, as you might imagine, this came as a total shock to her, that she was just another girl, just a really fast one. She eventually has come out and said, God made me the way I am, and I accept it. She's also been quoted as saying, I'm just a different kind of woman. So this issue, this case of being intersex, she by no means is the only one. Again, if I had more time, I have a video this woman at least used to make a living as a model, came out as intersex. This is a video that came out some years ago from Australia, Phoebe Hart, daughter, sister, wife. She's not a hermaphrodite. Right? If you look at the subtitle, she's intersex. She doesn't make eggs and sperm. She doesn't make either. This is a photo that you can easily find on the internet. I tried to find the original source of it, and I think it was a convention, a meeting. And I can't absolutely confirm this, but I believe every single one of those people has a Y chromosome. Right? So this is that concept of intersex, which is part of the way the world around us exists. So I knew that some of you would immediately want to ask me, well, so how common is this? And the answer is it depends on your definition. So there is a strict or narrow definition that you are only intersex if your chromosomes don't agree with your apparent sex. The broader definition is there's a wide variety of issues that cause people to not be what we would think of as typically male or typically female. And some of you in the audience, for example, know Turner's syndrome are women who only have one X instead of two. Klinefelter's men have two X's and a Y. That's included as intersex in the broad definition, but not in the narrow definition. So if you want numbers, you have to decide on your definition first. And the broad definition has been reported to be measured. You could debate this and go out and get your own data, but it's 1.7% of people. If you follow the narrow definition, it is 1/100th of that. And so one of the things that people who are against thinking about this or taking this into consideration, one of the things that you commonly hear is, oh, there's so little of them, why do we even need to worry about it? Well, the problem with that frame of reference, that point of view, is that we live in a country that's got somewhere around 342 million people, right? Depending on your resource, plus or minus a couple of million. And with 342 million people, 0.018% is over 61,000 Americans. And if you prefer the broader definition, then we're well above 5 million people who have this life. And to kind of narrow that down, I see you're leaving, that's fine. If anybody else has a class to go, please feel free to get up and go. I was hoping to do this faster. If you think about ASU, right, our advertised total student body is about 10,000. And that means that one or two if you round up, of us meet that narrow definition. And I should point out, it's not always XY people who look female. It is rarer, but it is possible for an XX person to appear to be male. And if you go with the broader definition, there's 170 people in the RAM fam that have one of these intersex type conditions. So you are certainly valid if you want to have the opinion that it's such a small number of people, I don't want to pay any attention to it. But it's people that we live with, right? People that are a part of our community. So medical professionals, particular obstetricians, people that are dealing with newborn babies, have two different scales. This is one of them, of noting what newborns look like. One is typical male, and then 6, 7 is typical female. There's a difference, but you can't tell until you hit puberty. And so if sex truly exists as two completely separate things, then all we would have is 1 and 6, 7. But medical professionals recognize that I deal with babies sometimes that are somewhere in the middle. And so this gives them a way of essentially rating, telling the world, you know, when I examine this baby, this is where they were. And so this is why some of you may have read or heard the phrase, sex is bimodal, not binary. What this term refers to, as you can see here, is that instead of everybody being one or the other, that there are people that are in between. I want to tell you, this particular graphic, if you care to take a photo of it, that link I got, this is a guy who doesn't buy it. He makes an argument for why it's wrong. And one of his comparisons is everybody knows if you flip a coin, you're going to get heads or tails. But every once in a while, it can land straight up and down. And he says, we should all just ignore that. I don't know if that's right. And I can't tell you if that's right or wrong. So I showed you this concept of being a hermaphrodite, and I want to make the point before I end, and I'm getting close to the end, is that these people who are intersex are in no way hermaphrodites. A hermaphrodite, like those plants and worms, function biologically, right, reproductively, as both a male and as a female. These people and other animals as well who are intersex cannot function biologically as a male, and they cannot function biologically as a female. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be wonderful people who are loved and productive and make excellent teachers and firefighters and everything else that we do. It just means that they have a different potential for reproduction. So, Castor Semenya was said to be female when she was born. That's her legal sex. And as far as everything says, if you see her standing around naked, looks like a female. But on the other hand, she has Y chromosomes. She has testes, even though they're not fully developed and they're not in the right place. And she has what is considered to be a typical male level of testosterone. And it's this last point. This is the only reason that anybody's ever heard of her, right? Because with everything else, she could have just lived a perfectly normal life. She just never would have given birth to children. But it was these high testosterone levels that got her attention as a highly competent world-class athlete. And since her case, and primarily because of her, there's now in some athletic organizations rules that if you have a disorder like this, you can't compete as a woman if your testosterone level is too high. And they give you an option. There's a drug you can take that will lower testosterone level. But a lot of people have a problem with this. And actually, there's a lot of people on both sides of the issue. So there's plenty of people, including a whole lot of women, that say we can't discriminate between different women. Every woman should have the opportunity to compete if that's what she wants to do. On the other side, there are people, including a whole bunch of women, who says, this is not fair, right? All of the rest of us, quote unquote, normal women, we don't have this advantage that she has. You can't let her compete with us. I don't know what the right answer is. But clearly there's an issue here that for certain circumstances, somebody has to decide. So as you all know right now, this has been a big part of politics. January 20th, 2025, this is the wording of part of President Trump's executive order. It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. 10 days later, our governor basically echoed these words. This office has consistently reiterated a simple truth. The state of Texas recognizes only two sexes, male and female. The Texas House, Bill 229 that some of you have heard of, starts with those same exact words in section 1, and then, I don't know, legal documents is a subsection 11, paragraph 11, whatever you would call it. In section 1 starts out by saying each individual is one of two sexes, male and female. which exactly agrees with what the president and the governor said, except it doesn't stop there. And Texas House Bill 229 goes on and recognizes that we have people who are intersex. You don't hear the governor talking about this, but this is what this bill says. It does say that we are not allowed to treat them as a third sex. And so I don't know what alternative that leaves to us. I guess that we recognize that there are a variety of different versions of males and a variety of different versions of females. That is not made clear. And so to kind of bring this to a close, I'm sorry it's taken so long. In addition to this list, Casper Semenya has a self-concept of being female. And she has stood by that and said, I have always been female. I am still female. As I said, she said, I'm just a different kind of woman. And for most of us, all of the time, that's good enough. You look female, you want us to call us female, we're good with that. Until you find out she has a Y chromosome, that might bother some of you. But what if that was not true? What if at the age of 19, when she was told, you have a Y chromosome, what if she had said, oh, I knew it. I've lived my whole life feeling like I was not a woman, I was not female. I knew I was a guy. Does she have the right to tell people, I'm not female, I'm a guy? Call me that? I can't tell you what the right answer to that is. Because what I can tell you, what I've done, is to present to you what I know of the science of this issue. How you think the appropriate way to deal with this information is. That's something that's outside of what science does. And I don't know the right answer. So, thank you for your attention. Again, I apologize, I went longer than I thought I was going to, but I do not have anything coming up for a while. So, feel free to stay and we can talk. I will answer questions that you